The gold room smelled of lemon polish and quiet wealth, a sanctuary designed for civilized agreements. But the two people sitting at the pristine mahogany table were far from civilized. They were the architects of my ruin. I'm Megan O'Connor, a professional mediator hired to divide their $1 million estate. Yet, as they squabbled over vacation homes and stocks, I didn't see assets. I only felt the biting cold of the porch where they left me to freeze 14 years ago. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Today, I held the pen, and it was finally time to balance the ledger. They call me a peacemaker. They are wrong. I am a closer. I sat at the head of the mahogany table in the gold room at Sterling and Halloway Mediation. The air here always smells the same lemon furniture, oil, heavy wool carpet, and the stale metallic scent of resentment. This room is soundproofed, designed to absorb the screaming matches of the city's elite, so that the receptionists outside hear nothing but the hum of the air conditioning. I ran my hand along the edge of the table. Not a scratch. I had presided over the dismantling of 40-year marriages in this chair. I had divided empires, custody schedules, and vacation homes with the precision of a butcher, yet I left no blood on the floor. My clients pay me an exorbitant hourly rate, not because I am kind, but because I am efficient. I do not offer tissues. I offer terms. Love. I often told myself as I organized my fountain pens in a perfect row, is just a negotiation that failed. My reflection in the darkened window showed a woman who looked the part. Megan O'Connor, 29, tailored in a charcoal suit that cost more than my father's car. My hair was pulled back in a severe, tight bun that pulled at my temples. I looked successful. I looked composed. I looked like a woman who went home to a rich life. The truth was, I went home to a silent apartment that looked like a hotel room. No photos on the mantle, no plants to water, no cat to feed. I had curated a life of perfect, impregnable solitude. Attachments were liabilities. People were variable variables. I preferred the constants. I checked my watch. My 2:00 p.m. appointment was late. I turned my chair toward the window. The sky over the city had bruised into a deep, angry purple. A sudden gust lashed rain against the glass, a sharp, rhythmic tat-a-tat-tat that cut through the silence of the room. My breath hitched. That sound. It wasn't just rain. It was a key, turning a lock I had rusted shut 14 years ago. The conference room dissolved. The mahogany table vanished. I was 15 years old. I was standing in a kitchen with yellow linoleum floors that were peeling at the corners. The air didn't smell like lemon oil. It smelled of pot roast and stale beer. They were screaming again. My father, Frank, was a large man, a looming shadow who took up too much space in every room. My mother, Martha, was a wire-thin woman with a voice that could strip paint. They weren't arguing about anything new. It was the same circular firing squad they had formed years ago. Money, the car, the drinking, the lack of money. "You're useless," Martha shrieked, throwing a dish towel on the counter. "I've wasted my best years washing your clothes." "Then leave." Frank roared, his face a mottled red. "Get out and take the nothing you came with." I should have stayed in my room. I knew the drill. Put the pillow over your head and wait for the door slams. But that night, the volume was different. It felt dangerous. I walked into the kitchen. I was wearing my pajamas, shivering despite the heat of the oven. "Please," I whispered. My voice was small, trembling. "Please stop. The neighbors are going to call the police again. Just stop it." The silence that followed was terrifying. They both turned to look at me. In a healthy home, this would be the moment the parents realized they had gone too far. They would apologize. They would comfort the child. But we were not a healthy home. Frank's eyes narrowed. He didn't see his daughter. He saw a witness. He saw a mirror reflecting his own failure. You, he spat, pointing a thick finger at me. Always you, always jumping in, Miss High and Mighty. I just want us to have dinner, I said, tears hot in my eyes. You're the reason we're like this, he shouted, the logic twisted by rage and exhaustion. You're a troublemaker, Megan. A burden. You stir the pot and make everything worse. We were fine before you walked in here. He grabbed my arm. His grip was bruising. He marched me toward the back door. Frank, wait, my mother said. But her voice was weak. She didn't move toward me. She stood by the sink, clutching the edge of the counter, watching. That was the betrayal that cut deepest, not his anger, but her paralysis. He opened the back door. The rain was torrential, a freezing downpour that turned the backyard into a swamp. He shoved me. I stumbled over the threshold, my bare feet slipping on the wet concrete of the porch. Cool off, he snarled, and don't come back in until you learn your place. The door slammed. The deadbolt slid home with a heavy clunk. I stood there stunned. The rain soaked through my thin pajamas in seconds. It was November. The wind bit into my skin like needles. I knocked on the door. Dad, Mom, I'm sorry. Please. Nothing. I waited. I sat on the old wicker chair on the porch, pulling my knees to my chest to preserve heat. I told myself they just needed 10 minutes. They would calm down. Mom would come open the door with a blanket. 10 minutes became 30. 30 became an hour. My teeth chattered so hard my jaw ached. I watched the kitchen window. I saw them moving around. They were eating dinner. They were eating the pot roast, sitting at the table as if I didn't exist. Then the kitchen light went out. Then the living room light. I stood up, my legs numb. I went to the window and banged on the glass. Let me in. It's freezing. The house went dark. The porch light flicked off. That was the moment. That was the trigger point. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a message. You are not wanted. You are not ours. I realized then that if I stayed on that porch, I would freeze. And when they found me in the morning, they would probably blame me for that too. I walked down the steps into the mud. I didn't have shoes. I walked 3 miles in the freezing rain to the fire station on 4th Street. I never went back. I entered the system. I went to foster care. And I learned the only lesson that mattered. Blood is biological. Loyalty is transactional. And when the transaction fails, you walk away before you freeze to death. Bless Ms. O'Connor. The voice snapped me back to the present. I blinked, the cold of the porch receding, replaced by the climate-controlled air of the office. My managing partner, Mr. Sterling, was standing in the doorway. He held a thick manila folder. He looked concerned. You drifted off there, Megan. Everything all right? Fine, I said, my voice raspy. I cleared my throat and straightened my glasses. Just waiting on the 2:00 p.m. They canceled, Sterling said, walking in and placing the file on the mahogany table. But this just came in. It's a rush, high net worth, but a bit messy. The intake team didn't assign a mediator because of the surname. They thought it might be a conflict. But I told them O'Connor is a common name. He tapped the file. I looked down at the label. The white sticker was typed in crisp black letters. Plaintiff, Francis O'Connor. Defendant, Martha O'Connor. Assets in dispute, $200,000. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird. The room seemed to tilt. Francis and Martha. Ms. O'Connor, Sterling asked again. Do you know these people? I stared at the names. I hadn't spoken to them in 14 years. I had no idea they had money. I had no idea they were still alive. And now the two people who had united only to destroy me were finally destroying each other. I could recuse myself. I could say, yes, these are the monsters who left me in the rain. I could hand the file back and go home to my safe, silent apartment. But then I remembered the click of the deadbolt. I remembered the porch light turning off. A cold, dark curiosity unfurled in my chest. I wanted to see them. I wanted to sit at the head of this table in my expensive suit, holding the gavel of their fate and watch them beg for the assets they loved more than their own daughter. I picked up my fountain pen. No conflict, Mr. Sterling. I said, my voice steady as steel. I'll take the case. I opened the file and signed my name on the docket line. M. O'Connor. The negotiation was about to begin. The gold room was designed for intimacy, but the observation deck adjoining it was designed for judgment. I stood in the darkened sliver of the control room, the one-way mirror cool against my forehead. My breath fogged the glass, a ghostly halo obscuring the view of the empty conference table below. I had instructed the receptionist, breathless with the urgency of the O'Connor case, to show the parties in separately. I needed a moment. I needed to see them before they saw me. I needed to calibrate the armor I had spent 14 years forging. The door to the gold room opened. My father, Francis O'Connor, entered first. The man I remembered was a colossus. He was 6'4" with shoulders that blocked out the sun, and a stride that shook the floorboards of our old house. He was a man of loud noises banging doors, heavy boots shouting matches. The man who shuffled into the room was a ghost of that giant. He was withered, his suit jacket hanging off his frame like a shroud on a wire hanger. He leaned heavily on a cane, a cheap aluminum thing from a drugstore, not the mahogany walking stick a man of his supposed vanity would prefer. His face, once ruddy with beer and temper, was the color of old parchment. He lowered himself into the leather chair with a groan that the microphone picked up clearly in my headset. A wet, rattling sound. "Mr. O'Connor," the receptionist asked, "can I get you water?" "Coffee," he rasped, "black, and tell that woman not to sit next to me." That woman? Martha O'Connor entered a moment later. If my father had shrunk, my mother had faded. She was always thin, a nervous bird of a woman. But now, she looked brittle. She wore a wool coat that was too heavy for the season button to the chin. But it was her hair that made my stomach turn. Martha O'Connor had always prided herself on her hair, thick auburn sprayed into an immovable helmet. The woman below me was wearing a wig. It was a decent quality, but it sat slightly askew the hairline, too dense the color, a flat, unconvincing chestnut. She clutched a leather handbag to her chest, as if it contained the crown jewels. "I won't look at him," she told the receptionist, her voice trembling. "Put me at the other end. I want the mediator. Where is the mediator?" I stepped back from the glass. The anger I had expected, the hot, white rage that had sustained me through foster homes and state colleges didn't come. Instead, I felt a hollow, sickening thud in my chest. They looked pathetic. They looked like ruins. But ruins can still fall on you. I straightened my blazer, checked my reflection in the dark monitor, and opened the door. I walked in with my closer stride, brisk, authoritative, indifferent. I placed my portfolio on the center of the table, creating a demilitarized zone between them. "Good afternoon," I said. My voice was an octave lower than my natural register, a vocal trick I learned in law school. "I am the appointed mediator for this settlement. You may call me Ms. O'Connor." I waited. This was the test. I was standing 5 feet from the people who made me. I had my father's jawline. I had my mother's eyes. Surely the biology would scream out. Surely the blood would recognize its own. Frank looked up, his eyes milky and tired. He squinted at me, then at my nameplate. O'Connor, he grunted. Common name. You Irish? My grandfather was. I said the lie tasting like ash. Martha didn't even look at my face. She was staring at my hands at the expensive pen I was holding. We don't need small talk, she snapped, though the bite was gone from her voice, replaced by a desperate rasp. We need this done. Today. I was told you are the best. Are you the best? They didn't know me. 14 years of absence had erased me completely. To them, I was just a suit. I was a service provider no different than a plumber or a mortician. I am the best, I said, sitting down and opening the file. But I am expensive and I do not waste time. I've read the prelims. You have a contested estate valued at $1.2 million. You have been separated for 6 months. You are here because you cannot agree on the division of assets. He's being impossible, Martha said, staring at the wall. She's a stubborn mule, Frank muttered to the table. Excellent, I said, uncapping my pen. Mutual contempt is a good starting point. It means you both want to leave. So let's make that happen. The initial joint session was a disaster of silence. They refused to speak directly, using me as a human telegram service, even though they were 3 feet apart. To break the deadlock, I initiated the caucus protocol, separating them into private breakout rooms to extract their true bottom lines. I went to Frank first. He was in the blue room, staring out the window at the rain. The room smelled of peppermint and something medicinal, distinct and sharp. Mr. O'Connor, I said, closing the door. Let's cut to the chase. The Cape Cod property. It's the crown jewel of the estate. Market value is $800,000. It's paid off. In a standard divorce, the husband usually fights to keep the real estate to maintain the equity. Frank turned. His hands were shaking on the handle of his cane. I don't want the damn house. I paused. Excuse me. I don't want it, he repeated louder this time. It's too big. The taxes are $12,000 a year. The roof needs work. It's a money pit. So, you want to sell it and split the proceeds? No. He slammed the cane on the floor. I want her to take it. Transfer the deed to Martha. Sole ownership. I narrowed my eyes behind my glasses. This didn't make sense. Frank was a miser. I remembered him screaming over a 10-cent discrepancy in a grocery bill. Now he was trying to offload an $800,000 asset. If you transfer the house to her, I explained slowly, you are essentially giving her 70% of the total estate. That creates a massive imbalance. You would be walking away with almost nothing. I have my pension, he muttered, looking away. That's enough for what I need. Mr. O'Connor, if you give her the house, you are burdening her with the upkeep. Does she have the income to support the property taxes? That's not my problem, he snapped, though he looked pained. She likes the ocean. She always liked the ocean. Just make her take the house, Ms. O'Connor. Tell her I'm fighting for the pension so she thinks she won the house. If she thinks I want it, she'll fight to take it out of spite. I wrote in my notebook, husband maneuvering to offload liability. Vindictive wants to drown her in property debt. I can try that strategy, I said coolly. But you understand you are financially crippling yourself. Just do it, he wheezed. I left him and walked across the hall to the green room. Martha was sitting with a box of tissues, dabbing at dry eyes. Mrs. O'Connor, I said, sitting opposite her. I just spoke with your husband. We are discussing the vacation home. I don't want it, she said immediately. I blinked. You don't want the house? I can't drive anymore, she said, her voice small. What good is a house I can't get to? He should have it. He built the deck. He loves that place. Frank indicated he is willing to let you have it. He's a liar, she said, clutching her handbag. He loves that house. He's just saying that to be difficult. Listen to me. The stocks, the portfolio. It's about 400,000 highly liquid. I want him to take the stocks. Martha, I said, dropping the Mrs. to create a sense of intimacy. If he takes the stocks in the house, you are left with nothing. A small portion of a pension, you'll be destitute. I have savings, she lied. I could tell it was a lie by the way she smoothed her skirt. I want him to have the cash. He needs new tires for his truck. He needs things. $400,000 buys a lot of tires, I said dryly. He likes to be comfortable, she cried out, frustrated. Why is this so hard? Why can't I just waive my claim? Because the court won't allow an inequitable split if they suspect coercion or fraud, I said sharply. And right now, this looks like fraud. I stood up and paced the small room. Let me get this straight. Your husband wants to force you to take a near $1 million property. You want to force him to take $500,000 in liquid cash. Neither of you wants the money. Both of you want the other to have the better deal. I just want to be done, she whispered. I walked out into the hallway and leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath of the filtered air. In 14 years of mediation, I had seen greed in every flavor. I had seen spouses hide diamonds in dog food bags. I had seen men bankrupt their own companies so their wives would get zero stock. I had never seen this. My mind raced through the O'Connor logic I had grown up with. They were selfish people, cruel people. If they were giving things away, there was a hook, the trap. It had to be debt. The house must have a lien on it. Frank wasn't disclosing. He wanted to saddle her with a foreclosed property. And the stocks, Martha probably knew a capital gains tax bill was coming that would wipe out the value. She wanted Frank to be on the hook for the IRS. They were playing hot potato with grenades. They were trying to destroy each other financially by pretending to be generous. It was the ultimate passive-aggressive war, perfectly on brand for the people who had locked me out in the rain. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. I had them. I knew their game. I checked my watch. I had enough ammunition to blow up their little charade. I wouldn't let them hide in separate rooms playing these games. I would drag them back to the main table and force them to look at the gifts they were trying to weaponize. I opened the door to the gold room and buzzed the intercom. Bring them back in, I told the receptionist. Both of them. And bring the notary. We're going to settle this, but not the way they think. If you have ever found yourself staring at a family dispute that just didn't add up, where the math of the heart conflicted with the math of the bank account, you know the specific kind of headache I was developing. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes, because sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones we are reading completely wrong. I didn't ask them to sit. I pointed to the chairs. When the heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing us in, the silence was instant and oppressive. I walked to the head of the table, my heels clicking on the hardwood border of the floor, like the ticking of a countdown clock. I didn't sit. I needed the height advantage. Frank slumped into his chair, his cane leaning against the edge of the table where it slid and clattered to the floor. He didn't pick it up. He just stared at his hands that were once capable of crushing a beer can, effortlessly now spotted with age and trembling with arresting tremor. Martha sat at the opposite end, clutching her purse as if it were a shield, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above my left shoulder. I looked at them both, the architects of my ruin. I have drafted the preliminary separation agreement based on your individual testimonies. I lied. I held up a blank legal pad. But before we proceed, we are going to address the anomalies in your demands. There are no anomalies, Frank grumbled, his voice scraping like gravel. Just give her the house papers. And I told you I won't sign them. Martha snapped, her voice rising to that shrill pitch that used to signal the beginning of a 3-day silence. I want the stocks, Frank. Why can't you just take the cash? Because I don't need it, he roared, slamming his open palm on the table. It was a weak hit compared to the thunderclaps of my childhood, but the intent was the same. Enough, I said. My voice was cold, sharp, cutting through the rising heat. Let's stop the charade. In my 14 years of practice, I have never seen two people fight this hard to become destitute. You are both maneuvering to offload assets and absorb liabilities. That suggests one of two things. Either these assets are toxic, encumbered by debt or legal trouble, or you are trying to punish the other person by forcing them to manage wealth they cannot handle. Punish? Martha looked at me, her face twisting in confusion. I'm not trying to punish him. I'm trying to help him. By leaving him with a liquid cash pile that will be taxed at 30% while you take a decaying property, I challenged. I turned to Frank. And you, Mr. O'Connor, you want to force a woman who claims she cannot drive to maintain a 4-bedroom estate on the coast. That is not generosity. That is cruelty. You don't know what you're talking about. Frank spat, his face flushing a dangerous shade of purple. You're just a lawyer. You don't know us. I know that people don't divorce to be generous, I countered, leaning over the table, pressing my palms into the wood. I know that you two have a history of volatility. I know that you are wasting my time because neither of you has the courage to say what you actually want. I want her to be safe, Frank yelled. He tried to stand, but his legs failed him, and he fell back into the leather chair with a heavy thud. Why won't you listen, you stubborn woman? Take the house, sell it. Hire a nurse. Just take the damn asset. I don't need a nurse. Martha screamed back, tears finally spilling over her rouged cheeks. I need you to have the money so you don't die in that miserable apartment. You never take care of yourself, Frank. You never have. You'll rot in there. I don't care about me. Well, I do. The air in the room seemed to vibrate. It was happening. The professional veneer of the gold room was melting away, revealing the ugly, jagged, rusted metal beneath. They weren't speaking to the mediator anymore. They were speaking to the ghosts of their 40-year marriage. Frank turned to me, his eyes wild. Tell her she has to take it. It's the law, isn't it? Tell her. Tell him, Martha pleaded, turning to me, her wig slipping slightly to the left. Tell him he has to take the stocks. Make him do it. They were shouting over each other, a cacophony of blame and desperate, twisted control. The sound was a physical assault. It wasn't just noise. It was a frequency I had spent half my life trying to tune out. It was the sound of the kitchen. It was the sound of the night the lights went out. You're a burden. You're a troublemaker. The pen in my hand snapped. The reveal. The ghost in the room. The sharp crack of the plastic shattering was loud enough to cut through their shouting. Ink leaked onto my thumb, dark and blue like bad blood. Stop it, the words ripped out of my throat. Not the measured, billable voice of Megan O'Connor-esque. It was the raw, terrified scream of a 15-year-old girl. I slammed the portfolio shut, The sound echoed off the soundproof walls like a gunshot. "Stop it, both of you." The silence that followed was absolute. Frank froze his mouth half open. Martha blinked, her hand flying to her mouth. I was shaking. The professional mask was gone, shattered on the floor with the pieces of my pen. I looked from one to the other, my chest heaving. 14 years, I whispered. The anger was rising now, a hot tide that I couldn't hold back. 14 years, and you haven't learned a single thing. You are still screaming. You are still throwing things. You are still so obsessed with being right that you don't care who you hurt. Frank frowned, confused. Excuse me. You kicked a child out into the rain for this? I asked, my voice trembling. For this noise? For this endless, miserable war? Martha squinted, leaning forward. She looked at my face, really looked at it for the first time. She looked past the glasses, past the severe bun, past the expensive makeup. She saw the eyes. Megan. She breathed. It was barely a sound. Frank's head snapped up. He looked at me, then at the nameplate on the table. M. O'Connor. He looked back at me, searching for the teenager in the woman. My God, Frank whispered. The color drained from his face completely. Megan, I sat on that porch for 3 hours, I said. I wasn't shouting anymore. I was stating facts, laying out the evidence of their crime. I banged on the window. I watched you eat dinner, and then you turned off the lights. We thought, Martha stammered, her hands shaking so hard her purse fell to the floor. We thought you went to your aunt's. We opened the door in the morning. You opened the door in the morning, I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping me. I was at the fire station by then. I was being processed by child services while you were having coffee. Megan, Frank said, his voice cracking. He reached a hand out across the table. His fingernails were blue. We looked. We called the police. They said you were in the system. They wouldn't let us. They said we were unfit. You were unfit, I said coldly. And you still are. Look at you. You're doing it again. You're trying to destroy each other, and you don't even know why. I stood there waiting for the defense. I waited for the excuses. I waited for them to tell me I was ungrateful, that I was a troublemaker, that I had deserved the cold. I was ready to destroy them with logic, to eviscerate them with the law, to leave them with nothing but their shame. But they didn't fight back. Frank slumped forward, putting his head in his hands. Martha began to weep, a deep guttural sound of pure mourning. The twist. The double diagnosis. I'm not trying to destroy her, Frank said. His voice was muffled by his palms. I'm trying to save her. I stood rigid. By forcing a house on her, she can't afford. That's not saving her, Frank. That's a trap. I can't take the house, Megan, he said. He looked up. His eyes were wet, red-rimmed, and filled with a terror I had never seen in him. I can't live in it. I won't be here. What are you talking about? Stage 4, he whispered. Pancreatic, it's in the liver now. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The air went thin. What? I asked. 6 months, Frank rasped. Maybe less. The doctors said, they said it's aggressive. If I keep the house, it goes into probate when I die. The state takes a chunk. The lawyers take a chunk. I wanted her to have the deed now, clean, so she can sell it and have the money for later. He looked at Martha. I didn't want you to be left with nothing, Marty. I wanted you to have the asset. I was going to go into a hospice center and just fade out. I didn't want you to watch it. I stared at him. The monster of my childhood was dissolving, replaced by a dying man, trying to perform one last clumsy act of service. Then Martha spoke. "You stupid old fool," she sobbed. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at him. She reached across the vast mahogany table, her fingers straining to touch his sleeve. "You stupid, stubborn fool." "I did it for you," Frank said. "I have glioblastoma," Martha choked out. Frank froze. I froze. "What?" Frank whispered. "Brain tumor," she said, tapping the side of her wig. "That's why I can't drive. That's why I wear this. The radiation. The doctors gave me 8 months, maybe a year if I'm lucky." She looked at me, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I didn't want the house, Megan. I wanted him to take the stocks, the cash. I wanted him to have the money to pay for a nurse, to pay for the pain medication. I didn't want him to die alone in a state ward because we ran out of money." She turned back to Frank. "I was divorcing you so you wouldn't be saddled with my medical debt. I wanted you to be free of it. I wanted you to be comfortable." The silence that descended on the room was heavier than any silence I had ever known. It wasn't the silence of anger. It was the silence of a tragedy so complete, so perfectly ironic that it defied language. The greed I had seen, it was grief. The hatred, it was protection. They were two people standing on the tracks of an oncoming train, pushing the other one out of the way, not realizing the train was wide enough to kill them both. "You're dying," Frank asked, his voice breaking into a sob. "We both are," Martha whispered. I stood at the head of the table, the ink staining my thumb, the broken pen at my feet. I had come here to watch them tear each other apart. I had come here to witness justice. Instead, I was witnessing the most heartbreaking, dysfunctional, and absolute love story I had ever seen. They had kicked me out to save themselves, and now they were trying to kick each other out to save the other. They were flawed. They were broken. They were dying. And for the first time in 14 years, I didn't see monsters. I saw two scared people in a room that was suddenly much too big. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum. It sucked the oxygen right out of the room, leaving us all gasping in the sudden thin air of the truth. My anger, which had been a roaring furnace for 14 years, suddenly had no fuel. You can hate a tyrant. You can hate a bully. You can hate a parent who chooses their own comfort over your safety. But it is impossibly difficult to hate a dying man who is trying in his own broken, clumsy way to fall on his sword. I stood at the head of the table, feeling foolish. The ink on my thumb was beginning to dry, a dark blue smear that looked like a bruise. I wiped it on a tissue, my hands trembling slightly. "So," I said. My voice sounded hollow, stripped of its professional cadence. "That's it then." They weren't looking at me. Frank had reached across the table. His large trembling hand was covering Martha's small pale one. He was rubbing his thumb over her knuckles, a repetitive, soothing motion I remembered from when I was a very small child before the shouting started. "I'm sorry, Marty," he whispered, his voice thick with phlegm and regret. "I didn't want you to know. I wanted to handle it." "You never could handle anything alone, Frank," she wept softly, using her free hand to adjust her wig, which had slipped during the argument. "You would have starved to death in a week. I would have ordered pizza." He tried to joke, but it came out as a cough. I watched them. I was standing 3 feet away, the daughter they had exiled, the mediator they had hired, and yet I was invisible again. The revelation of my identity had shocked them, yes, but the revelation of their mortality had eclipsed me entirely. They were a closed loop of dysfunction and devotion. They were apologizing to each other for the secret of their deaths, but neither had said a word about the life they had stolen from me. I felt a sharp, stinging sensation behind my eyes. It wasn't just sadness. It was a profound sense of irrelevance. Even in their final tragedy, there was no room on the stage for me. I was just the clerk processing their exit. I sat down slowly in my leather chair. The fight was over. There was no negotiation to be had. You cannot negotiate with stage 4. The surprise character. The intercom on the table buzzed a harsh electronic jar against the soft weeping. "Miss O'Connor," the receptionist's voice crackled. "The medical addendums have arrived. Dr. Thorne is here to deliver them personally. He insists on coming in." I pressed the button. "Send him in." The door opened and the air in the room shifted again, grounding us back in the sterile reality of the present. Dr. Eris Thorne stepped into the gold room. He looked exactly as I remembered him, perhaps, a bit more weathered, like an old oak tree that had survived a few too many winters. He was wearing a tweed jacket that had seen better decades and carrying a battered leather medical bag. He wasn't the kind of doctor who practiced in glass towers. He was a town doctor, the kind who made house calls and remembered your grandmother's blood type without looking at a chart. He stopped at the threshold, taking in the scene. He saw Frank slumped in the chair. He saw Martha wiping her eyes. And then he looked at me. His eyes, sharp and blue behind wire-rimmed spectacles, widened slightly. He didn't gasp. He didn't exclaim. He just gave a slow, solemn nod of recognition. He knew. In a small town, the doctor always knows. "Megan," he said softly. It was a statement, not a question. "Dr. Thorne," I replied, standing up. "Thank you for coming." He walked to the table, his gait uneven, favoring his left hip. He didn't hug me. He didn't bring up the fire station or the night I vanished. He was a man of medicine, and he saw 3 patients in a room full of open wounds. He prioritized the bleeding. "Francis, Martha," he said, his voice grave. He pulled a chair out and sat between them, placing his bag on the floor. "I told you both to get your affairs in order. I didn't mean this." He gestured around the opulent conference room. "We're fixing it." "Eris," Frank muttered, looking ashamed. "We're settling the assets." "You're wasting time," Thorne said. He didn't sugarcoat it. He opened his bag and pulled out 2 thick manila envelopes. He placed them on the mahogany table. The sound they made, heavy, dull thuds, was more terrifying than any gavel. "The reality check. I have reviewed the pathology reports from the oncologist and the neurologist," Thorne said, looking from one to the other. "I'm not going to use Latin. I'm going to use English." He pointed to Frank. "The tumor in the pancreas has compromised the liver function. You are looking at significant pain management needs within 6 weeks. You will not be able to live alone." He pointed to Martha. "The glioblastoma is pressing on the temporal lobe. Your vision is already going. Motor function will follow. You cannot care for him, Martha. You will soon need care yourself." "We know," Martha whispered, shrinking into her coat. "Do you?" Thorne asked. He turned his gaze to me. "Miss O'Connor, as the legal representative here, do they understand the timeline?" "I don't think so," I said, quietly. Thorne leaned forward, clasping his hands. "If you proceed with a divorce, the court freezes the assets. A contest of this size. In this county, it will take 6 months just to get a preliminary hearing on the division of property. Another 6 months for probate if one of you passes during the proceedings." He let that hang in the air. "If you divorce," Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a shout, "Frank will die in a rental apartment. He can't afford waiting for a check that won't clear until he is in the ground. And Martha, you will spend your final months in a state-subsidized facility because the liquid cash you want to give him is locked in an escrow account." Frank looked up, terror dawning on his face. "But," We have to separate the money to save it. There is no saving it for later, Thorne said. There is only now. The law moves at the speed of bureaucracy. Your diseases move at the speed of biology. Biology is faster, Frank. Always. He looked at me again. They have less than a year, combined. If you let them file these papers, you are sentencing them to die alone, separated by a legal wall that serves no one. The room fell silent again. The rain lashed against the window harder now, as if trying to wash the building away. I looked at the papers. I looked at the two people who had thrown me away. I held the power to grant their wish. I could finalize the divorce. I could let them have their justice. I could let Frank die in a cheap apartment and let Martha fade away in a ward. And I could walk away telling myself I just did my job. It would be poetic justice. They separated themselves from me. Now they would be separated from each other. But looking at Dr. Thorne's weary face and the terrified grip Frank had on Martha's hand, the irony lost its flavor. It just tasted like ash. We often think of justice as a balancing of scales, an eye for an eye. But sometimes, when you look closely at the scales, you realize that adding more weight to the other side doesn't fix the balance. It just breaks the machine. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. Because in the end, the only thing heavier than a grudge is the regret of holding it too long. I looked down at the divorce decree I had started to draft. Dr. Thorne is right, I said. I picked up the file. You don't have time for a divorce. The file felt heavy in my hand. It was just paper pleadings, financial affidavits, medical prognosis, but it weighed as much as a tombstone. I looked at Frank and Martha. They were watching me with the terrified obedience of children waiting for a verdict. They knew I held the power. I could process this divorce. I could let the machinery of the state grind them down. I could walk out of this room and leave them to the nightmare they had created for themselves. It would be the ultimate vindication for the 15-year-old girl shivering on the porch. It would be justice. But as I looked at my father's trembling hands knotted with arthritis and fear, and my mother's wig slightly askew and bordering on the ridiculous, the thirst for vengeance evaporated. It left behind a dry, dusty realization. There is no glory in defeating an enemy who has already surrendered to death. To destroy them now wouldn't be strength. It would be cowardice. It would mean I was still the victim, still reacting to their cruelty, still letting them dictate who I was. I took a breath. The air in the room was still smelling of rain and old wool. Miss O'Connor? Dr. Thorne asked gently, watching my face. I didn't answer him. I stood up and walked to the heavy credenza behind me. I turned on the industrial shredder. The machine hummed to life, a low, hungry vibration. What are you doing? Frank asked, his voice rising in panic. Megan, those are the papers. I didn't look back. I fed the petition into the slot. The machine roared, gnashing the legal arguments into meaningless confetti. I fed the financial affidavits next, then the custody of assets. Zzzt, zzzt. The sound was violent, final, and incredibly satisfying. There is no divorce, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I am dismissing the petition with prejudice. The act of mercy. The O'Connor Trust. I turned off the shredder and walked back to the table. I sat down, pulled a fresh yellow legal pad from my portfolio, and uncapped a new pen. But the money, Martha wept, wringing her hands. The medical bills. If we stay married, the debt will ruin the survivor. No, I said firmly, because we are not going to do this the way you planned. We are going to do this the way I decide. I began to write, the pen scratching loudly on the paper. I fell into the rhythm of my profession, the cold, comforting logic of contract law. We are going to execute an immediate liquidation of the Cape Cod property, I stated, not asking for permission. The market is hot. I have a broker who can move it in 30 days for cash. We will take a hit on the speed, but we need liquidity. Frank opened his mouth to object, but I held up a hand. Quiet, Frank. I'm speaking. He closed his mouth. We will take the proceeds from the house, the stocks, and the pension, and we will place them into an irrevocable living trust. I continued outlining the structure on the pad. I will serve as the sole trustee. The trust will pay your medical providers directly. It will pay for hospice care. It will pay for pain management. I looked up at them. This protects the assets from being frozen in probate. It ensures the money is used for your care, and it ensures that neither of you can hoard it or hide it. You would do that? Dr. Thorne asked, surprised. That's a significant amount of work, Megan. I am the best closer in the city, I said flatly. I can have the trust documents ready by morning. I looked at my parents. They were stunned. They had come here expecting a battle, and instead I was building them a fortress. There are conditions, I added, my voice hardening. Anything, Martha whispered. Condition 1. You will not live apart, I commanded. You will not die in separate apartments like strangers. You will return to the main house. We will use the trust to hire 24-hour nursing care, so you, Martha, do not have to lift him, and you, Frank, do not have to drive her. They looked at each other, tears streaming down their faces. Condition 2, I said, leaning forward. You will stop fighting. You will stop screaming. You will spend whatever time you have left with some semblance of dignity. If I hear that you are shouting at each other, I will freeze the trust and let the state take over. Do you understand me? It was a bluff. I would never do that. But they needed a warden. They needed boundaries. We understand, Frank said. He sounded small, grateful, and infinitely old. Good, I said. I ripped the page off the legal pad and slid it across the mahogany table toward Dr. Thorne. Get them to sign this letter of intent. I'll handle the rest. The lesson, dignity, in the end. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. The storm outside had broken, leaving behind a gray, dripping stillness. Dr. Thorne helped Frank stand up. Martha gathered her purse with shaking hands. They looked like two castaways who had been pulled from the ocean, exhausted, battered, but alive. They turned to leave. At the door, Frank stopped. He turned back to me. He looked at the daughter he had thrown away, the woman who had just saved him from a death of poverty and solitude. His lips moved. He wanted to say my name. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to bridge the 14-year canyon between us with a word. I raised my hand, palm out. A stop sign. Don't, I said softly. He started. Go home, Frank, I said. Take care of your wife. I didn't offer a hug. I didn't offer forgiveness. Forgiveness is a heavy thing, and I wasn't ready to carry it yet. But I offered them mercy. And in that moment, mercy was enough. He nodded a jerky, broken motion. Dr. Thorne guided them out, and the heavy oak door clicked shut. I was alone in the gold room. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. The streetlights were flickering on, reflecting in the puddles on the pavement. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't happiness. This wasn't a happy ending, but it was lightness. The heavy, grinding weight of my anger, the stone I had carried in my pocket since I was 15, was gone. We often convince ourselves that the only way to win against those who hurt us is to hurt them back. We think justice looks like an eye for an eye. But I've learned that true power isn't about destruction. It's about refusing to let the cruelty of others turn you into something you're not. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is break the cycle even when you have every right to continue it. I turned back to the conference table. It was a mess of fingerprints, coffee rings, and the invisible residue of grief. I picked up the spray bottle of polish and a microfiber cloth from the side cabinet. I sprayed the mahogany. The smell of lemon filled the air, sharp and clean. I wiped the table. I wiped away Frank's fear. I wiped away Martha's regret. I wiped away the ghost of the girl they had abandoned. I polished the wood until it shone like a mirror, reflecting only the ceiling lights and the woman standing tall in the center of the room. I was Megan O'Connor. I was a closer. And for the first time in my life, the case was truly closed. Megan found peace not by forgiving, but by showing mercy. Have you ever had to be the bigger person in a difficult family dynamic? Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. We truly appreciate you being here. There are even more captivating stories waiting for you right on your screen. Please click one now so you don't miss the ending. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.